You know that feeling when you think you're winning and then suddenly everything changes? That's exactly what happened to America in October 1957. It was a quiet evening. Most families were at home, listening to the radio or watching television. Then came the news that shook the entire country. The Soviet Union had launched a small metal sphere into orbit around the Earth. They called it Sputnik 1. For the United States, it wasn't just a scientific achievement, it felt like a national humiliation. Here was the Soviet Union, a country many Americans thought was backward and struggling, beating them to space. The beeping signal from Sputnik could be heard by amateur radio operators all over the world. It was shocking. But what most people didn't know at the time was that this success wasn't the result of some giant, well-organized space agency. There was no single Soviet NASA. The entire program was driven by a few secret design bureaus, and the most important one was led by one man. His name was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. In Asif Siddiqui's book, Challenge to Apollo, we finally get a clear and detailed look at how the Soviet Union took an early lead in the space race, even while operating under an incredibly difficult political system. Korolev wasn't just another engineer, he was a survivor. He had spent years in Stalin's Gulag, survived torture and starvation, and still came back to lead one of the most ambitious technological efforts in human history. While the world celebrated Sputnik, very few knew that the real architect behind it was a man the Soviet government kept completely secret for decades. He was known only as the chief designer. The launch of Sputnik 1 marked the beginning of a fierce competition that would last almost 2 decades. The Americans were caught completely off guard. In Washington, there was panic. Politicians, scientists, and the military suddenly realized they were behind in a race they didn't even know had started. President Eisenhower tried to calm the public, but fear spread quickly. Newspapers warned that Soviets might soon be dropping nuclear bombs from space. Schools began pushing harder on science and math. The space race had officially begun, and for the first few years, the Soviets were clearly ahead. Yet beneath those early victories, deep problems were already forming inside the Soviet system. Problems that would eventually cause them to lose the race to the moon despite starting far in front. This is the story of how the Soviet Union went from dominating the early years of space exploration to watching America land on the moon first. It's a story of brilliance, secrecy, political games, incredible achievements, and heartbreaking failure. And at the center of it all stands one man, Sergei Korolev, the hidden genius who almost beat America to the moon. To really understand who Sergei Korolev was and why his story matters so much, we have to go back to the very beginning. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev was born in 1907 in a small town in Ukraine. From a very young age, he was different from other children. While most kids were playing simple games, Sergei was already building model airplanes and dreaming about flying. As he grew older, his fascination turned into something much bigger. He became obsessed with rockets and the idea of reaching space. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Korolev was full of energy and ambition. He joined gliding clubs, learned to fly, and quickly became one of the most promising young rocket engineers in the Soviet Union. He worked with a small group of enthusiastic dreamers who built experimental rockets in old warehouses with almost no money. They believed rockets could take humanity beyond the Earth, even when most people thought it was impossible. By the mid-1930s, Korolev's future looked very bright. He had designed and helped launch some of the Soviet Union's first liquid-fueled rockets. He was talented, driven, and full of big ideas. But then tragedy struck. The year was 1938. Stalin's Great Purge was at its height. The Soviet Union was gripped by fear and paranoia. Millions of innocent people were arrested on false charges. Anyone with talent or foreign contacts was suddenly seen as dangerous. Korolev had both. He had traveled abroad and corresponded with rocket scientists in Europe. That was enough for Stalin's secret police. One night in June 1938, the NKVD came for him. He was arrested at his home and charged with treason and sabotage. The accusations were completely made up. They claimed he was deliberately slowing down rocket development to help foreign powers. What followed was pure horror. Korolev was brutally tortured. His jaw was broken, his teeth were knocked out, and he was beaten so badly that he would suffer from chronic pain for the rest of his life. Under unbearable pressure, he eventually signed the false confession. He was sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag. He was sent to one of the worst places in the entire Soviet Union, the Kolyma gold mines in far eastern Siberia. The conditions there were inhuman. Temperatures dropped to minus 50 degrees. Prisoners worked long hours in freezing cold with almost no food. Disease and starvation killed thousands every month. Korolev nearly died there. He suffered from scurvy, lost most of his teeth, and became extremely weak. Many of his fellow prisoners died around him. Yet even in that living hell, Korolev never gave up his dream. In the rare moments he had, he would draw rocket designs in the snow with a stick, or quietly discuss space travel with other imprisoned engineers. After 2 years of unimaginable suffering, his situation improved slightly. He was transferred to a special prison design bureau near Moscow, where imprisoned scientists were forced to work on military projects. It was still prison, but at least he was working with rockets again. Even behind bars, Korolev continued to think about space. His passion never died. By the time World War II ended, Korolev had spent nearly 7 years as a prisoner of the system he wanted to serve. He had gone from a promising young engineer to a broken man marked as an enemy of the state. But his story was far from over. In fact, the hardest years were behind him, and his greatest chapter was about to begin. By 1944, after 6 long and brutal years in prison, Sergei Korolev's life was about to take a dramatic turn. The Soviet Union was still fighting in World War II, and they desperately needed advanced rocket technology. They had seen how powerful the German V-2 rockets were, and Stalin wanted the Soviet Union to catch up as fast as possible. That need saved Korolev's life. He was transferred from the deadly Kolyma camps to a special prison design bureau near Moscow. It was still a prison, but the conditions were much better. He could sleep in a real bed, eat actual food, and most importantly, he was allowed to work on rockets again. Even though he was still officially a prisoner, Korolev threw himself into the work. He studied the captured German V-2 rockets in detail. He didn't just want to copy them. He wanted to improve them and build something even more powerful. In 1945, after Germany surrendered, Soviet teams brought back tons of German rocket technology and even some of the German engineers who built the V-2. Korolev was now part of a top-secret program to develop Soviet missiles. By 1946, he was officially appointed as the chief designer of a new rocket program. For the first time in years, he had real resources and a team. He worked night and day, often sleeping only a few hours on a cot in his office. Korolev's vision was always bigger than just building weapons. While most Soviet officials saw rockets only as military tools, he kept pushing them with one big idea: using these rockets to explore space. He wanted to launch the world's first artificial satellite. Many officials thought he was crazy. They asked why should they waste money on a silly metal ball when they needed better missiles for war. But Korolev fought hard. He argued that launching a satellite would prove to the entire world that the Soviet Union was technologically superior. Eventually, he won approval. In the years that followed, Korolev and his team at OKB-1 worked relentlessly. They developed the R-1 and R-2 missiles, learning from both their successes and their failures. The pressure was enormous. Every test launch carried huge risks, and failure could mean serious consequences. But Korolev never lost sight of his dream. By the mid-1950s, he was finally ready to attempt something that had never been done before: placing a man-made object into orbit around the Earth. He had no idea that this single decision would change the course of history and shock the entire world. The stage was set. The space race was about to begin. And Sergei Korolev was ready to lead the Soviet Union into the unknown. The success of Sputnik 1 in October 1957 was far more than just a scientific achievement. It was a political earthquake that shook the entire world. For the Soviet Union, it was a moment of immense pride. For the first time, they had proven that they could surpass the United States in technology. Newspapers across the globe ran dramatic headlines. In America, the reaction was pure shock and panic. Many people suddenly felt vulnerable. The idea that the Soviets could now reach space before them was terrifying. But while the world celebrated Sputnik, very few knew the real story behind it. Korolev and his small team at OKB-1 had worked under extreme pressure and secrecy. The R-7 rocket, which carried Sputnik into orbit, was originally designed as a military missile. Turning it into a space launcher in such a short time was an incredible engineering achievement. Just 1 month later, in November 1957, Korolev pushed even further. He launched Sputnik 2. This time, there was a living passenger on board, a small dog named Laika. She became the first living creature to orbit the Earth. Although Laika did not survive the mission, it proved that biological life could endure the stresses of launch and weightlessness. The world was stunned once again. Over the next few years, Korolev's team kept delivering one historic first after another. In 1959, they sent Luna 2, which became the first human-made object to reach the moon. They even managed to photograph the far side of the moon, something no one had ever seen before. By 1961, Korolev was ready for his greatest challenge yet, sending a human being into space. He personally selected and trained a group of young fighter pilots. Among them was a 27-year-old named Yuri Gagarin, a smiling, charismatic, and highly skilled pilot who quickly became Korolev's favorite. The preparations were intense. Korolev checked every single detail himself. He knew that one mistake could kill the cosmonaut and destroy the entire program. On April 12, 1961, the moment finally arrived. As the R-7 rocket carrying Gagarin lifted off, Korolev stood in the control room, his heart racing. When Gagarin's voice came through the radio saying, "Poyechali," let's go, the tension in the room was electric. For 10 and 108 minutes, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth. He became the first human being in space. When he returned safely, the Soviet Union exploded with joy. Gagarin was paraded through Moscow as a national hero. Millions celebrated in the streets. Korolev, however, remained in the shadows. The government still refused to reveal his identity. While Gagarin became world famous, the man who made it all possible was still known only as the chief designer. Those years between 1957 and 1964 were truly the golden age of the Soviet space program. Under Korolev's leadership, the Soviets achieved first after first: the first satellite, the first animal in orbit, the first pictures of the far side of the moon, the first human in space, the first woman in space, and the first spacewalk. For a while, it really looked like the Soviet Union was going to dominate space exploration for decades. But even during these incredible triumphs, cracks were already starting to form. Korolev was working himself to exhaustion. His body, damaged by years in the Gulag, was beginning to fail him. At the same time, political rivalries inside the Soviet system were growing stronger. Other chief designers wanted more power and were challenging Korolev's leadership. Still, Korolev kept pushing forward with his biggest dream: sending a Soviet cosmonaut to the moon before the Americans could get there. He had no idea that time was running out faster than he thought. After Yuri Gagarin's flight in 1961, the space race entered its most intense and dramatic phase. Sergei Korolev knew the next great prize was the moon. He was determined to get there first. While America announced Project Apollo with the goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s, Korolev was already secretly working on his own lunar program. His plan was incredibly bold. He wanted to build a giant new rocket called the N-1, a super heavy rocket that would be even more powerful than America's Saturn V. This rocket would carry Soviet cosmonauts all the way to the moon. But from the very beginning, serious problems appeared. Korolev had powerful rivals inside the Soviet system. The most important one was Valentin Glushko, a brilliant but difficult engine designer. Glushko refused to build the giant engines Korolev needed for the N-1. Because of this conflict, Korolev was forced to use many smaller engines instead. This made the rocket extremely complicated and much more likely to fail. At the same time, Korolev's health was getting worse. The years of torture and starvation in the Gulag had left permanent damage. He suffered from constant pain and serious heart problems. Yet he refused to slow down. He worked 16 to 18 hours a day, sleeping only a few hours on a cot in his office. Despite all the difficulties, Korolev kept pushing forward with incredible determination. He personally oversaw every detail of the N-1 rocket and the new Soyuz spacecraft. Then, in January 1966, came the tragedy that changed everything. Korolev went into the hospital for what was supposed to be a routine surgery to remove polyps from his throat. The operation seemed simple, but his body, weakened by years of suffering and overwork, could not handle it. During the surgery, severe bleeding started. The doctors fought desperately to save him, but they couldn't stop it. On January 14, 1966, Sergei Korolev died on the operating table at the age of 59. His death was a devastating blow to the entire Soviet space program. When the news reached his team at OKB-1, many engineers broke down in tears. The man who had led them through so many impossible challenges was gone. Without Korolev's leadership, vision, and ability to solve problems under pressure, the Soviet lunar program quickly began to fall apart. The giant N-1 rocket, which he had fought so hard to build, suffered from serious design problems. Between 1969 and 1972, all 4 test launches of the N-1 ended in spectacular failures. The rocket never reached orbit. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America's Apollo program moved forward smoothly. In July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to walk on the moon. For the Soviet Union, it was a bitter defeat. Many historians believe that if Korolev had lived just a few more years, the outcome of the moon race might have been very different. His death removed the one person who could hold the complicated Soviet system together and make bold decisions. But even though Korolev did not live to see his greatest dream come true, his influence did not disappear. The technologies and methods he developed continue to shape the Soviet and later Russian space program for decades. His story is one of the most tragic in the history of space exploration. A man who put the first satellite in orbit, the first animal, and the first human being in space, but died just as the greatest prize was within reach. When Sergei Korolev died in January 1966, the Soviet space program didn't collapse overnight, but it was never quite the same again. The man who had been the driving force, the decision maker, and the visionary was gone. Without him, the Soviet lunar program quickly lost momentum. The giant N-1 rocket, which Korolev had fought so hard to build, became a symbol of failure. Between 1969 and 1972, the Soviet Union attempted to launch the N-1 4 times. Every single attempt ended in disaster. The rocket exploded on the launch pad or shortly after liftoff. The most powerful rocket ever built by the Soviets never made it into space. While the N-1 program was falling apart, America succeeded. In July 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon. For the Soviet Union, it was a painful and very public defeat. But the story didn't end there. After losing the race to the moon, the Soviet Union changed direction. They focused on long-term goals rather than spectacular firsts. They began building a series of space stations. First came the Salyut stations, and then in 1986, they launched the Mir space station. Mir was a remarkable achievement. It stayed in orbit for 15 years and became the first long-duration space station where humans lived and worked for months at a time. Cosmonauts broke record after record for time spent in space aboard Mir. It showed the world that the Soviets were still capable of great things in space. They also continued improving the Soyuz spacecraft, which Korolev had helped develop. Even today, Soyuz remains one of the safest and most reliable ways to reach space. In 1988, the Soviets achieved one more impressive milestone. They launched the Buran space shuttle. Unlike the American shuttle, Buran flew completely automatically, without any crew on board. It successfully orbited the Earth and landed perfectly on its own. Many experts believed Buran was technically more advanced than the American version. Unfortunately, it only flew once. Economic problems and the collapse of the Soviet Union meant the program was canceled. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself fell apart. The once powerful space program suddenly faced a severe financial crisis. Budgets were slashed. Many talented engineers left the industry or moved abroad. For a while, it looked like the end of Russia's proud space legacy. But the foundation Korolev had built proved to be surprisingly strong. In the years after the collapse, Russia became America's most important partner on the International Space Station. Russian Soyuz rockets and spacecraft carried American astronauts to the ISS for many years after the space shuttle was retired. Even with limited money, Russia continued to play a vital role in human spaceflight. Today, when we look at the history of space exploration, we can see clearly that the early Soviet successes were not an accident. They were the result of one man's extraordinary determination and vision. Sergei Korolev started with almost nothing. He survived Stalin's terror and the Gulag. He worked in secrecy. He fought against political rivals and technical problems, and yet he still managed to put the first satellite, the first animal, and the first human into space. His death marked the beginning of the end of Soviet dominance in space. But his ideas, his designs, and his dream continued to live on. The story of the Soviet space race is ultimately the story of one man's incredible journey, from the depths of a Siberian labor camp to the heights of human achievement. And even though the Soviet Union ultimately lost the race to the moon, Korolev's legacy remains one of the greatest in the history of exploration. A little speed. More than 50 years after his death, Sergei Korolev's name is still spoken with respect in the world of space exploration. He never walked on the moon. He never saw the International Space Station. He never witnessed private companies sending astronauts into space. Yet almost everything we have achieved in human spaceflight carries his fingerprints. The Soyuz spacecraft he helped design is still flying today. It has carried hundreds of people safely to and from space for over 60 years. No other crewed spacecraft comes close to its reliability. The idea of building modular space stations, which he pioneered with Salyut and Mir, became the foundation for the International Space Station that we still use today. Even the way modern Russia continues to participate in space exploration is built on the work Korolev started in the most difficult conditions imaginable. His story is one of the most remarkable in human history. Here was a man who was arrested, tortured, and sent to the Gulag. A man who nearly died from starvation and disease in the frozen mines of Kolyma. A man whose jaw was broken and whose body was permanently damaged by the Soviet system he wanted to serve. Yet he never gave up his dream of reaching the stars. He survived the worst the system could throw at him and came back to lead one of the greatest technological achievements of the 20th century. He put the first satellite in orbit, the first living creature in space, and the first human being in space. For several years, he made the Soviet Union the clear leader in the space race. But in the end, the same system that created him also destroyed his greatest dream. Political rivalries, bureaucratic interference, and the loss of his leadership after his death caused the Soviet Union to fall behind in the race to the moon. Korolev's life shows us both the incredible potential and the tragic limits of the Soviet system. He proved that one determined individual can achieve almost anything, even under the harshest conditions. But he also showed how politics, jealousy, and poor decision-making can destroy even the greatest visions. Today, when a Soyuz rocket lifts off from Baikonur, when astronauts live and work on the International Space Station, And when we look up at the night sky, we are still benefiting from the work of a man who once drew rocket designs in the snow with a stick while starving in a Siberian labor camp. Sergei Korolev never became as famous as Neil Armstrong or Wernher von Braun during his lifetime. The Soviet government kept him hidden for most of his career. But history has a way of revealing the truth. He was not just the chief designer. He was one of the greatest engineers and visionaries the world has ever seen. His story reminds us that great achievements rarely come from comfortable and easy conditions. They come from people who refuse to give up, no matter how much the world tries to break them. Because of Sergei Korolev, humanity took its first real steps toward becoming a spacefaring civilization, and that legacy will continue as long as we keep looking up at the stars.